In this segment, I want to talk about scandal. And specifically, I want to talk about the Watergate scandal that rocked the Nixon administration in 1973 and 74. It's a scandal that grew out of the propensity of the executive branch under Nixon to utilize the tools available to it to investigate and, in some instances, outright harass those entities, those groups that the administration felt were threatening to the United States, but ultimately were threatening to the Nixon administration itself. To understand sort of the roots of Watergate, we really have to look at the 1972 presidential election. And it should have been, and really in some ways was, a rather easy victory for Richard Nixon. Granted, Nixon had run into trouble with Congress. It was a Democratic Congress, and Nixon had failed to get a good chunk of his legislation through Congress. Primarily the more conservative elements of what he wanted to accomplish. And that didn't look too good, perhaps. Maybe there was some fear there that conservatives would reject Nixon based upon his failures of achievement. But he had done other things of considerable note. And then if we add to that the leaking of the Pentagon Papers and the rather negative light that those Pentagon Papers had thrown on the Johnson administration and Nixon for that matter, basically any executive branch relationship to Vietnam, that too potentially could hurt Nixon with the electorate. But I think it's more important to remember that Nixon always felt besieged. There was always that level of paranoia and insecurity, and it may not have mattered what had or hadn't happened leading up to 72. One suspects that Richard Nixon would have been concerned about losing the election in 72. He was, after all, fairly isolated in the White House, constantly buffeted by news reports, unsure of himself, and I think reaffirmed in his fears by his own palace guard, in particular H.R. Haldeman, who was the chief of staff, Nixon's chief of staff, and John Ehrlichman, who was the chief domestic advisor to the president. Sort of yes men, if you will. If you wanted to see Nixon, you essentially went through Haldeman. As far as competition, in 1972, Nixon faced off against Senator George McGovern from South Dakota. McGovern tended to lean left. In conservative circles, certainly he leaned left, and I think left of middle America. He had proposed a $30 billion, in fact was committed to a $30 billion reduction in the United States defense budget, which would have, in sort of conservative circles, curtailed the power of the United States worldwide to resist communist aggression, endangering the United States in the Cold War. But it wasn't just policy, it wasn't just ideology that got McGovern into trouble. In the midst of the campaign, thanks in no small part to the Nixon administration, it became known that McGovern's vice presidential running mate, Thomas Eagleton of Missouri, Senator Thomas Eagleton, had earlier in his life been treated for mental illness. That calls into question, of course, for many Americans, the capacity of the vice president to step into the presidency should that need arise. But the way McGovern handled it was also rather poor. It demonstrated a vacillation, a lack of confidence, a lack of clear thinking and determination. Because McGovern initially supported Eagleton to continue on the ticket and then reversed his position. So the result was not only is McGovern a liberal, open to the young, open to radical ideas and radical influence, but more important, McGovern vacillates and waffles. He doesn't have the backbone or the decisiveness to be president, something that Nixon could turn around and say, well, I do. You can make your own decision there. Just a note, if I remember correctly, I know he was a veteran of the Second World War, but if I remember correctly, McGovern was a bomber pilot. You can look that up for me and see if I'm right, but you know, it takes a heck of a lot of courage to fly, you know, a bomber over Europe, and you wonder. But image matters politically. It always really has, and certainly continued to in the 1970s. And the image McGovern had projected was one of weakness. It turns out it was a relatively easy win for Nixon. But then June 17th, 1972, now notice that that's before the actual presidential election. June 17th, 1972, as the campaign is ongoing, police in Washington arrest 5 men who have broken into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. Now, these headquarters are located in the Watergate office complex in Washington. And then the police will arrest 2 more associates later. A grand jury is impaneled or seated, and information begins to come out about what these burglars were doing at the DNC headquarters. It turns out that they were employees of an organization known as CREEP, which is just apropos in a way. CREEP, C-R-E-E-P, which stands for the Committee to Re-elect the President. Later, these burglars would be referred to as kind of the code name required. It came out that they'd gone under this code name, the Plumbers, which is fascinating in its own right. But what really struck people as the grand jury investigated was that money to finance the burglary had been funneled through members of the White House staff. Suddenly there is a linkage to the White House. More importantly, it comes out, that's not more importantly, but it sure is important, it comes out that as early as May 28th, the DNC offices had been bugged, that listening devices had been placed in the offices of the Democratic National Committee. Nixon says, you know, we'll cooperate. We're going to launch an internal investigation to see what, if anything, the White House had to do with this break-in or the placing of listening devices. And he put in charge of this investigation a fellow by the name of John Dean, who was counsel to the president. What will follow, among other things, will be, well, let's just start here. Coming out of that investigation, a letter emerges written by James W. McCord going back to March, or in March of 1973, I should say, in which there are claims made that suggest perjury and witnesses operating under duress, and ultimately will implicate the man leading the investigation, going back to John Dean. Dean turns, well, how do I put this? Turns coat, if that's appropriate, and begins working with prosecutors on April the 16th, once he's been implicated in this influencing of witnesses. Also, the news of this pushing of witnesses, and then Dean's shift, his loyalty from the White House to himself, in a sense, will lead to the resignation of both Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Dean in April of 1973. So April of 1973, Nixon's now won the election, but that sort of palace guard is beginning to crumble. They're taking the brunt of the payment for the events that have occurred. There's really nothing at this point to link Richard Nixon directly with the break-in or the other activities that have come to light as a result of the investigations. But in May of 1973, that's May 1973, the Senate will launch its own investigation. It'll create a committee, the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, known as the Senate Watergate Committee. And to further investigate the administration. Remember, a lot of this has kind of been in-house. The hearings began, and this is really one of my first historical memories. It's a memory of Watergate, and in particular, Senator Sam Ervin conducting the hearings. And he's from North Carolina. Howard Baker for the Republicans on the minority side from Tennessee, which goes back to the whole political shift that's been taking place in the South as Republicans gain a foothold and expand politically. Well, as the Senate Watergate Committee investigates, John Ehrlichman is clearly implicated in efforts to cover up crimes that were committed, but also a broad range of other potential criminal acts, including wiretaps, intercepted mail, burglaries, illegal contributions being accepted, money laundering. And on June the 13th, a memo was found which connects Ehrlichman with the burglary of a psychiatrist's office. It turns out that this burglary had been conducted to get information on Daniel Ellsberg, who had copied and then released to the New York Times the Pentagon Papers, which had shed such a negative light on U.S. Vietnam policy and the actions of the Johnson and ultimately the Nixon administrations in sort of covering up the facts on the ground from the American people. But then we come to implications that Nixon actually knew about the crimes being committed and may actively have worked to cover them up. John Dean claimed in testimony that he had had as many as 35 meetings with the president and that they had actually discussed what to do about knowledge that these crimes had been committed. But there remained no smoking gun, and Richard Nixon sort of goes on the offensive. He goes on national television and announces to the American public, quote, "I am not a crook." But then, the Senate investigation, Alexander Butterfield, aide to the president, is giving testimony when he sort of lets it slip in answer to a question that there is or was a taping system in the Oval Office that would have captured whatever was said and would thus have captured the words of Richard Milhouse Nixon. The Senate requests the tapes. Nixon responds by claiming executive privilege, which is to say that the executive branch is an independent branch of government, is not answerable outside the constitutional requirements, not answerable to the other branches of government, and therefore certain documents that demand confidentiality because of their relation to the executive branch do not need to be released, that they can be withheld from the other branches of government. Nixon offers a compromise. He suggests that he would release a transcript and would allow select Republican senators to actually listen to limited portions of the tapes, mainly to show that they were of no consequence and not particularly interesting. But then on October the 20th, 1973, a major event occurs. Archibald Cox, who is the special prosecutor operating on behalf of the executive branch's own investigation, really, Archibald Cox says that the deal Nixon has suggested is not satisfactory, it's not acceptable, and demands that the tapes be released. Nixon orders his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Richardson refuses and resigns. Nixon then orders Deputy Attorney General to fire Cox, and when that individual refuses, he's fired or resigns, depending on how you look at it. Finally, the acting Attorney General, Robert Bork, who will later go up as a Supreme Court nominee and not make the court, fires Archibald Cox. Nixon names a replacement, Leon Jaworski, who is appointed special prosecutor. Public pressure over the events of what comes to be known as the Saturday Night Massacre, because this all happened, very brief span of time, really one evening. Public pressure forces Nixon to release 8 tapes requested by the Senate. But when they are released, it's discovered that there is an 18.5-minute gap. Congress begins the process of impeachment. It turns out that with all these other problems, the Vice President of the United States, Spiro Agnew, resigns October the 10th over a scandal that had occurred when he was governor of Maryland. Agnew had really been Nixon's bulldog, a rather distasteful sort of individual going after political opponents of the president across the country. It turns out that Agnew had accepted kickbacks and had been guilty of, or at least suspected of, guilty of tax evasion, and he pled no contest to charges leveled against him. Into the vice presidency steps a little-known representative from Michigan, Gerald Ford, House Minority Leader, a moderate Republican who was amiable and considered trustworthy. Well, in July of 1974, the Supreme Court gets involved. July 24th, 1974, the Supreme Court reaches its decision in United States versus Nixon. Leon Jaworski subpoenas 64 tapes. He'd done that in April of 1974. Instead, Nixon releases edited transcripts. They were embarrassing. They were laced with profanity, full of racial epithets, anti-Semitic tirades, and demonstrated to the American people the isolated paranoia of Richard Nixon in the Oval Office. The court, in its decision, claimed the power to set limits on the power of the president when evidence was concerned of a criminal nature. The court's decision was unanimous and instructed Richard Nixon to release the tapes without, 18-minute gap or anything else. In Congress, now feeling able to impeach the president, remove the president, that's what impeachment ultimately means. Hearings began May the 9th, 1974. The House Judiciary Committee adopts 3 articles of impeachment, July 27th through the 29th, 1974. The way impeachment works, of course, going back to Andrew Johnson, first example of presidential impeachment, the House of Representatives basically acts as sort of a grand jury to determine if there are grounds for the charges to go forward, and then a trial is subsequently held in the Senate over which the Chief Justice, the Chief Justice oversees the Senate trial. Rather than face that trial, Richard Nixon announced his intention to resign from the presidency. He did this on August the 8th, 1974. And he subsequently then leaves Washington, D.C. and resigns effective August the 9th, 1974. The first, and so far only, president to actually resign from the office of President of the United States. If the United States was in turmoil before, think about the turmoil in 74. 1968 had seen a president who had been so popular 4 years earlier decline to run for his party. So tarnished, perhaps, had become the presidency in public opinion terms, even among his own party. 68 had seen the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, the convention, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and 1974, just a few years later, the President of the United States, who had promised law and order, is implicated in the commission of criminal acts. Though never charged or found guilty, he was certainly implicated sufficiently for Congress to seek impeachment. I think that goes to that theme we talked about earlier. Why Americans perhaps had begun by the 1970s to wonder about the future of their republic. The economy, the cultural tensions, and along with the Pentagon Papers, signs of individuals in power more than willing to lie to the American public. Next segment we'll take up with the consequences of Watergate and the 1970s. We'll continue.